Great. Okay, thanks everyone for being here. I'm Andrew Dustin. I'll be kind of chairing the session, keeping time and whatnot. We have a great set of speakers coming in front of me at least, and so let's get right to it. This is going to be a 4-paper session, so we'll each have 20 minutes. I'll keep time, and I'm the residual claimant on time, so I'll make sure to keep you all on time. We're going to start with Marco. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll share my screen first. Okay, I hope everything is okay. Well, very happy to present my research here. This is actually my job market paper. The title is School Choice, Mismatch, and Graduation. This is joint work with Marilena Ortega Hesles. I'm a PhD candidate from the University of Western Ontario, and she works at Via Educación. Okay. So first, I'll tell you about the general issue. So centralized education systems allocate students to public schools that have limited seats. So there is this scarcity kind of problem, right? In every centralized education system, some schools face excess demand. Let's say the top schools, there are always like a lot of students that want to go there. There are not enough seats. But public schools cannot use prices to ration seats. That would be a market solution. And also public schools are not allowed to have preferences over students. That would be like more similar to the college market, but in, at least for primary and secondary education, they cannot do it. So then the planner defines this thing that we call the school priorities. And this is how the excess demand problem is solved. It's a ranking of students of who gains admission and who doesn't. There is great heterogeneity in how policymakers define these priorities. For example, sometimes they use test scores, GPA, siblings, residential zones, lotteries, etc. But in principle, how priorities are defined is quite important, because think of the case where there are heterogeneous skills among the students, and the planner decides to put all the weight in one particular skill. So then you could create this mismatch problem that leads to low graduation rates. In addition, let's say you put all the weight in a measurement of a student skills that favors one gender versus the other. Let's say you put all the weight on the standardized test and female perform a bit lower on the standardized test, then you're affecting the equity of access. So the motivation for this paper is that most of the literature takes school priorities as given and study the consequences of using different matching algorithms to allocate the students. So basically, somehow the priorities have been decided in the past. Now let's find the best way to allocate the students. But in principle, a priority structure is part of the design of the centralized system. And because it's part of the design, it can be modified. So in a recent review of centralized education systems around the world by Trusick and Nilsson, what they find is that there is a lot of heterogeneity in how systems define priorities, even for a given matching algorithm. Let's say 2 systems use the student proposing deferred acceptance, but they use 2 completely different sets of priorities. And little is known about the consequences of centralized systems using different priority structures. So what we're going to do in this paper is that we're going to work with data from Mexico City in 2007. This is a centralized admission system for high schools, where students submit rank order lists of up to 20 high schools. These are the application lists. The system has a priority index that is based on an admission exam score. And there are different types of schools. Let's call them elite and non-elite. I'll define them later. And all schools share the same priority index for admissions. So it's the same ranking of students to get admitted into the different type of schools. So the question we're gonna try to answer in this paper is that, is the system ignoring some valuable information they could have used to create better student school matches? Specifically, we're gonna focus on the information contained by GPA. For example, there's been some literature recently that shows that, let's say, grades measure effort, self-control, and personality traits to a higher degree than achievement tests. And in addition of that, the skills measured by grades are important determinants of desirable education outcomes. So in a way, by not putting any weight on GPA, you might be not putting any weight in these like skills that are behind the creation of grades. So the paper has two parts. I'll first tell you something about the first part. So in the first part, what we're gonna study is, heterogeneity in an RDD. So basically, we're gonna do an RDD, and we're gonna show that, even at the margin of admission, there is heterogeneity by other skill measurements. So we're gonna estimate the effect of admission to an elite school on graduation. We're gonna find that there is no effect on graduation. However, the effect is negative for students with below median GPA, and it's actually positive for students with above median GPA. And these two effects cancel out, and then you find no effects overall. Then the effect is actually negative for males, and it's positive for females. And as it happens to be, females have higher GPAs than males. So this is kind of a composition thing. Okay, now in the second part of the paper, after showing these results, why this measure, like this, the skills that GPA is measuring might be important, we're gonna try to think about this. What can we do about it? We found there is this kind of mismatch. We're gonna try to think of a policy that we could implement. So we're gonna design this counterfactual admission policy where elite schools use a priority index that equally weights the exam and GPA. So we're gonna take advantage that we observe the application list so we can assign students by simulating the matching algorithm. So what we're going to find in our counterfactual is that the share of female and low-income students at elite schools increases. The graduation rate from elite schools increases. I'm going to explain you later how I do this graduation rate in the counterfactual. And lastly, we're going to estimate preferences to recover the utilities behind the rank order list, so we can quantify welfare gains and losses. So what we're going to find is that there is no aggregate change in welfare. However, female welfare increases in the counterfactual while male welfare decreases, and low-income students' welfare increases while high-income students' welfare decreases. So now about the data and about the context of education in Mexico City. So there are 6 years of elementary school, 3 years of middle school, and 3 years of high school. So middle school students submit rank order lists and then take a system-wide admission exam. So this is the main input to create this priority index for admissions. Students are prioritized based on this admission exam score, and all schools use the same priority index. So the matching algorithm is the serial dictatorship. So you order applicants by admission exam score, and proceeding in order, you assign each applicant to her most preferred school among the schools that still have available seats. It's a very standard matching algorithm, and it's a special case of the student proposing deferred acceptance. So this mechanism is going to create something called admission cutoffs, which are the score of the last admitted student on oversubscribed school. So the data we are going to use for the analysis is the data of the system in 2007, the admission system. So we have roughly 300,000 students, which is quite important for us because this is what it's going to allow us to study heterogeneity later on, because RDDs are very data hungry. So we observe the admission exam score, middle school GPA, rank order list, some sociodemographics such as gender and family income, and we observe the matches produced by the algorithm, like student I is allocated to school J. About the high schools, there are roughly 650 high schools, and we observe the type of each school, like if it's an elite school or not. We observe the number of seats offered by each school, and we observe the school admission cutoffs. So for our outcome, what we're going to do is that we follow the cohort of applicants in 2007 and collect administrative records to see what happened with them. Let's say what happened with them 3 to 5 years after admission, like did they graduated or not? So these are administrative records. So now about the schools, for you to have an idea what I mean when I say elite schools, schools in Mexico City are grouped into 9 subsystems. And there are 2 subsystems that I highlight in blue here that are considered elite. They are considered elite partially because they are affiliated to the 2 most prestigious public universities in Mexico City. But in addition of that, as we can see in this table, they do not offer, like it's 23% of the total number of seats offered is the seats at the elite schools, but more than 63% of the students actually put an elite school as their first option in the rank order list, which creates that the admission cutoffs for these schools is pretty high. So it's pretty competitive to get admitted into these schools. And in addition of that, they are affiliated to these best public universities in Mexico City. Okay, now about the RDD, which is the first part of the paper, all elite schools are oversubscribed, and admission to them requires clearing their admission cutoffs. So basically, we can do an RDD. And the RDD is going to identify the average treatment effect of admission to an elite school on graduation for students at admission cutoff. because you have the continuity assumption, so you're basically estimating the effect at a boundary point. And we're going to focus on the average treatment effect and not on the local average treatment effect, because in practice, 97.4% of the students that are admitted to an elite school actually enroll. So we are not going to do a fuzzy RD, we're just going to do a sharp RD. Students at admission however, students at admission cutoff can be heterogeneous in other skills that affect graduation. For example, you can be at admission cutoff and have a high or a low GPA, because the correlation between the admission exam score and the GPA is only 30%. So what we're going to explore is the average treatment effect for students at admission cutoff is different for students with above and below median GPAs. Okay, so these are the results. Let's say we ignore heterogeneity by GPA, and we're going to find that there is no effect on the probability of graduation. So this is like of being admitted to an elite school. Okay, next, we're going to split the sample by above and below median GPA. So what we're going to find is that for students with below median GPA, there is a decrease in the graduation, whereas for students with above median GPA, they have an increase in the graduation probability. And basically, these two effects are roughly similar. They are like close to 8 percentage points, so they cancel out, and then that's why we don't see any effects when we pull all the students together. Now, in addition of that, as it has been shown by previous literature, males tend to have higher admission exam score in a standardized test in general, whereas females have higher GPAs. And this is also the case in Mexico. So we have that males have higher admission exam scores, while females have high GPAs. Now, when you think about it, the system decides when they create the priorities to put all the weight on the admission exam score. So then what could be the problem here? Well, you might not be admitting a lot of female students that wanted to go to these elite schools. And in addition of that, so because of that composition effect, we also study these heterogeneous results by gender. And we're going to find that this almost replicate the results by above and below median GPA. So basically, for males, there is a decrease in their probability of graduation, whereas for females, when they manage to go to an elite school, actually the probability of graduation increases. And yeah. So the next thing we're going to do, this is the second part of the paper, we're going to study this counterfactual admission policy. So motivated by our RDD results, we're going to construct the following counterfactual. Elite school use equal weight on the admission exam score and GPA to create their priorities. The algorithm is going to become the student proposing deferred acceptance, because now different schools have different priorities, which is basically we're no longer in the serial dictatorship case. So the assumption for this part of the paper is going to be that the rank order list do not change in the counterfactual. Okay, but we have some reasons why do we believe this is a reasonable assumption. The first one is that the matching algorithm is a strategy proof before and after we do the counterfactual. So in principle, the rank order lists reflect the true preferences. And one potential concern is that there is a constraint in the length of the rank order list that could incentivize a student to be strategic. But in the Mexico City case, the constraint is not really binding. So only like less than 3% of the students rank the maximum number of schools they can rank, that is 20. So to have a mapping between the new student characteristics at different schools and the graduation probabilities, we're going to estimate these linear index models for each school. So this is basically going to give us a mapping between a vector of characteristics and a probability of graduation. And so as the covariates, we're going to include measures of academic preparation, such as the admission exam score, middle school GPA, some demographics such as gender and age, and to control for some something that would go on the side and that might be correlated with this excess, we're going to use these Dale and Kruger controls. That basically Dale and Kruger controls are you use characteristics of the application list to control for potential unobserved heterogeneity. So we're going to include the number of elite schools in the rank order list, the length of the rank order list, and the average cutoff of the schools in the rank order list in the previous admission cycle. So now, how are we going to do this counterfactual admission probability? Now, think about it this way. First, a student with characteristics X had this previous admission probability Pj, but now this student with characteristics X is going to be assigning the counterfactual to school J prime. But because we have all the mapping defined, we can just calculate the new graduation probability in the counterfactual. And that's what we do. Okay, so now, once we change the admission priorities in elite schools, we're going to have, students are going to move around. So some students that were at non-elite schools are going to be at elite schools, and the other way around. So you can see that in the off-diagonal elements of this matrix, and yeah, that's kind of roughly how many students were moving around in this counterfactual. About the results of the counterfactual, so first of all, now at elite schools, we're going to see more females. And this is because females have higher GPAs than males. And now we're putting some weight on GPA. So we see 9 percentage point more females. The graduation rate is going to increase close to 8 percentage points in our counterfactual. There are going to be some effects at non-elite schools, but they are minimal. And overall, the graduation rate in the system is going to increase by 1 or 2 percentage points that I didn't put in this table. Importantly, the counterfactual is also going to increase the share of low-income students at elite schools, because GPA is less correlated with income than the admission exam score, mainly because there are a lot of test preparation centers that are private that only high-income students can afford, and they get higher scores in the admission exam score. So once you put weight on GPA, and this is less stratified by income, what you find is that you increase the share of low-income students at elite schools. And this is what we can see. This has differences in percentage points between the shares in the counterfactual and the baseline. The next thing we're going to see is, okay, we do all these things, everything seems to be good, but would the students like it? Or who would like it and who wouldn't like it? So for that, we're going to try to quantify this welfare trade-off. So the counterfactual is going to increase the percentage of females assigned to their first choice and decrease the percentage of males assigned to their first choice. And this is what we can see in blue in this table. So these are, the position in the rank order list where students get assigned to. Like overall, there are no changes, but there are differential changes by gender. But when you see this table does not quantify by how much this changes. It could be the case that males really, really like elite schools, whereas females just like it a little bit, and then you don't know exactly by how much the welfare is changing. So we need a measure with cardinal value, and that's what we're going to do next. So because we observe the rank order list, we can model the indirect utility of choosing a given school. So we're going to estimate this rank order logit model, let's say. So the characteristics are going to be like J characteristics are an elite school indicator, the previous year cutoff. The individual characteristics are the standardized score, different than the admission exam because the students do not observe the admission exam score when they apply, a GPA and gender. And we're going to have, importantly, we're going to have distance. And having distance is going to help us with adding some cardinality to this measure, because as you can see, we rescale the coefficient of distance to 1. We normalize the coefficient to distance to 1, such that the utilities are measured in miles. So we're going to estimate the preferences from the rank order list. After we do that, we can calculate the expected ex-ante utility from the assignments the student obtained. So for example, we can calculate the welfare a student gets from being assigned to a particular school in the data, and the welfare now they get from being assigned to this other school in the counterfactual, let's say. And everything is going to be measured in miles. So it's a measure with cardinal value. So as we saw on the table, overall, the welfare does not change from the assignment in the data to assignment in the counterfactual. This is the distribution of welfare in miles between the data and the counterfactual. However, as we also saw on the table, there is higher welfare for females and lower welfare for males. But importantly, females' welfare increases by the same quantity that male welfare decreases. So it's not like we're hammering men and improving welfare for females. It's more or less there is a welfare trade-off. Okay. And lastly, we see this welfare by income, because we saw that more low-income students gain access to elite schools. We see welfare by income, and what we're going to find is that there is higher welfare for low-income students and lower welfare for high-income students. Importantly, in this figure is that the pivot point seems to be 7,000 pesos, and 79% of the students have family income of 7,000 pesos or less. So the welfare is increasing for most of the students. Okay. Now to conclude, in this paper we show that admission priorities are defined. How admission priorities are defined in a centralized system affects equity of access and the graduation rate. In Mexico City, not ignoring the information contained in GPA when defining priorities increases the access of female and low-income students to elite schools, increases graduation rate from elite schools, and then does not affect overall welfare, but increases females and low-income students' welfare at the expense of males and high-income students' welfare. Okay, so to conclude, GPA is not a standardized measure of preparation. Yeah, we all know that it's not a standardized GPA, but it measures some skills that affect the probability of graduation and seem to be important. So adding some weight to it when defining priorities can be beneficial. However, if you were to put all weight on GPA, you could create this thing called rate inflation, making it a less informative input to define priorities in the future. And that's the paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Marco. I'm sure we're all clapping, but on mute. Feel free to, I'll lead the way with the clapping emoji there. This is awesome. Okay, so we are going to structure the session in such a way that we just have the back-to-back presentations, and then the residual time will be for pooled discussion. So let's see if we can end this screen share and start the next one, which as soon as that gets on the screen, and I'm sure the next speaker is introduced. So Macarena, are you here?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I had issues with the internet, but it's working now, so I'm here.
Yeah. Okay, can you try to share?
Yes, let me.
Perfect.
Okay, can you all see my screen?
Looks great.
Perfect.
All right, take it away, Macarena.
Okay. Hi everyone. Thanks for joining me today. So I'm going to present the paper called Centralized Admission Systems and School Segregation, Evidence from a National Reform. This is a joint work with Sanyukta Nath, who is currently doing a postdoc at Stanford, and Sergio Ursua from the University of Maryland. So all over the world, governments are increasingly adopting centralized admission school systems to coordinate students' assignments to schools. So different versions of these programs can be, have been implemented in England, France, Spain, the United States, etc. And centralized admission programs are often seen as providing equal access to school. So they are frequently used as policy tools to promote diversity. And most of the times they give priority to low SES students at the randomization stage. For example, New York and Boston have made substantial reforms in recent years to give minority groups higher chances to attend better schools to ensure greater equity in the public system. However, a more efficient theoretical allocation might not necessarily lead to less segregated schools. In particular, recent evidence has highlighted that the existence of residential segregation and heterogeneity in the outside option have the potential to drive the opposite results. So for example, this recent paper by Caterina Calzamiglia and others, they show that preferences for nearby schools can increase segregation levels across schools if low-income families care more about proximity to school than about school quality. Also, heterogeneity in the outside option, which is private schools in this setting, can also lead to a similar results. So students from wealthier families can be strategic in the rankings by only applying to the best public schools because they have the chance to opt out to private schools if they are not assigned to their preferred public schools. So in this paper, we study a large-scale adoption of a centralized allocation system in Chile and its effects on school segregation. In 2015, the Chilean government gradually introduced a deferred acceptance mechanism as the central component of a national education reform that was aimed at reducing school segregation. So this reform came to replace the country's decentralized system that I'm going to discuss a bit more in the next slide. So what we do is that we exploit the sequential introduction of the reform across regions to quantify its impact on segregation using a difference in different strategy. So we analyze rich administrative data from the universe of Chilean students during the period from 2015 and 2019. And our outcome of interest is the similarity indicator or the Duncan index, which indicates the share of low SES students within a district that would have to be reassigned across schools to achieve an even distribution of students of different socioeconomic status. So the main analysis focuses on ninth graders. As for this group, we observe a high percentage of students using this new mechanism to switch schools And we also observe their socioeconomic background information. So as a quick preview of the results, we do not find a statistically significant impact of the policy on average school segregation. However, we do find considerable heterogeneity across local school districts or municipalities on these two features that I mentioned earlier. So we find that in areas with high levels of existing residential segregation, the reform increased within school segregation. And we also find that a higher provision and differential access to private schools is also associated to an increase in segregation. So a little bit of background. There are three types of school in Chile: public schools, which are managed by local municipalities and financed by vouchers; voucher schools that are privately managed but financed by government vouchers also; and private schools, which are private, which the private sector provides both the funding and the administration. So an important problem of the Chilean educational system is that it is highly segregated. So the attendance to different schools depends on a lot on family background characteristics. And before the reform, the student admission process was highly unregulated, and most voucher and private schools selected their students based on parental interviews, entry exams, and often require proof of income. So this resulted in an overwhelming majority of lower tier students in public schools, which is one of the principal reasons for this increased stratification. So in an attempt to promote inclusion, in May of 2015, the Congress passed the inclusion law, or Ley de Inclusión Escolar, which the major component was a centralized school admission system. So one of the foundations of this reform was the regulation of the school admission system for public schools as well as voucher schools. So all the two types of schools receiving state support. So this implies that a student must participate through this system if he or she seeks admission into these schools. And admission to private schools continue to be decentralized. So basically, family must apply to their most preferred school with a rank order logic. The matching process is entirely managed by the government, doesn't involve any intervention by schools. So this ensures that the schools do not have any space for selecting students. And families are required to apply through a government-run website, which provides information about the school educational project, its facilities, etc. The algorithm allows for special priorities, such as if the applicants have a sibling enrolled in the school, if they are classified as priority students, if they are children of school officials, etc. But importantly, note that there are no restriction on the school set that the family can list, and the proximity to school doesn't play any role. So there is no neighborhood priority here. So since private schools do not participate in this system, parents could switch to those schools if they are not satisfied with the final assignments. Importantly to our study, the implementation was gradual, which is critical to our identification. So the reform began in 2015 with Magallanes region. In 2017, it continued with 4 more regions. In 2015, included 9 more regions. And finally, in 2019, the Metropolitana region was included. So for the analysis, we merged rich student level administrative data with socioeconomic information that comes from the national standardized exams. So along with these standardized exams, which are administered at different rates, parents have to complete a comprehensive questionnaires that provide us with relevant background information of all the students, such as parental education and household income. So for the analysis, we focus on 9th graders, which is the first year of high school. So the participation in the system is mandatory for students entering the system, so in pre-K, and for those who want to switch schools. However, since we don't have information background, socioeconomic background information for pre-K, we use ninth graders for whom the participation is particularly high because at least 50% of the students are forced to switch school as their primary school do not offer secondary education. And for them, we have background information from previous records. And to measure socioeconomic segregation, we construct the dissimilarity or Duncan index. So this index has to be constructed relative to a specific geographical area. And we define the school district at the municipality, because even though the system runs nationwide and a student could apply to any school in the country, virtually all students apply exclusively within their municipalities. And so the Duncan index, as I said before, measures the percentage of students belonging to low SES who have to be reallocated across schools for equal representation of students from all socioeconomic backgrounds in the district. So our final sample consists of 327 municipalities over 5 years. So an important component of the analysis is residential segregation. So residential segregation might limit the integration of students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, even under a centralized admission system, if low-income families are more likely to leave for quality schools, because this could translate into higher levels of segregation in schools. So what we do is that we build an index of commuting time to amenities, such as hospital and police station. So we want to capture the idea that residents from advanced and disadvantaged areas are exposed to very different bundles of amenities. So several regions in the country, particularly the most populated one, present concentration of individuals from different socioeconomic groups in specific pockets. So for example, in this figure, we illustrate the fact that, so we illustrate this for Biobío, which is a large region in Chile. So this shows that special segregation, that there is a special segregation from by income levels. So we show that in panel A and B, the contours are not overlapping. So while high income families are especially in panel A, are especially more concentrated in the south, west, and the east part of the region, low-income families have higher densities in the north and central parts of the region. Also, the outside option plays an important role. Since private schools do not participate in the system, parents can switch to private schools if they do not like the assignment. However, private schools are expensive and there might be income barriers to entry. So entry exams, interviews to parents, etc. The local provision of education throughout Chile is highly heterogeneous. So in this figure, we show the spatial distribution of school types in two large regions. And we can see in panel A, for the metropolitan regions, we show that while private schools are more common in municipalities belonging to the northeastern sectors of Santiago, they are almost non-existent in the southern districts. For Coquimbo, for example, another province, the picture is quite different as the distribution of school types are much more homogeneous. So we analyze the distribution of school types in each district, and we also calculate the standard deviation of travel time to private schools to capture the differential access to private schools. Please let me know when I have 5 minutes left. So we take advantage of the longitudinal dimension of our data, as well as the gradual implementation of the policy to estimate its impact on school segregation. So in particular, we follow a standard difference in difference strategy, where the outcome variable is the Duncan index in municipality C in the region R at time t. And we estimate the following regression, where D RT is the treatment variable, which takes the value of 1 if the program is implemented in region R in year T and 0 otherwise. We add region fixed effects to account for time invariant heterogeneity and that level. Gamma captures aggregate differences in segregation over time, and the covariates C include pre-policy measures of local schooling structure, mostly, and also epsilon is the error term. So throughout the analysis, we cluster the standard errors at the school districts, as this accounts for serial correlation. So the identification of the delta zero depends on the standard assumptions of difference in difference, so parallel trends. The adoption date of the policy for every region in Chile should be random to existing levels of school segregation before the policy, and there shouldn't be any response in anticipation of the treatment. So importantly, we explore the heterogeneity in the effect of the policy on segregation, allowing for heterogeneous responses by residential segregation and the outside option. So our main results here, we find no significant effect of the policy on segregation, but we do find important heterogeneous effects. So in this table, we report the relevant estimated coefficients. So in the first column, we report the interaction of the treatment dummy with the variation in access to amenities, our residential segregation measure. So the coefficient is positive and statistically significant, suggesting that municipalities with higher variance in access to these public schools experience an increase in school segregation due to the policy. So now we turn to the empirical analysis of the outside option. So the idea is that if high-income families responded by switching to private schools, then the centralized admission system does not necessarily reduce the school segregation. So such switches will be more prevalent in municipalities with higher fraction of private schools. So we first present the results supporting this hypothesis. So column 2 shows that municipalities that had a higher fraction of public and voucher schools with respect to private schools experience a decrease in segregation due to the policy. Or in other words, municipalities with higher fraction of private schools before the reform became more segregated due to the new admission system. And we also explored the impact of private schools on segregation using the variation in travel time to private schools. So the coefficient of these interactions, the coefficient on the interaction of the standard deviation travel time to private schools, and the SES dummy, the treatment dummy, is also positive. So this provides further support to our results that differential access to private school drives up school segregation in the presence of the new policy. So I'm not going to get into details here, but we also find a potential mechanism. So we construct the fraction of students switching from public and voucher schools to private schools. And we find that high SES students were more likely to respond to the policy by moving from these public and voucher schools to private schools. So we perform a series of tests examining common pre-trends assumptions. We also made a lot of robustness tests that I'm not going to get into for sake of time. So just to conclude, we find no overall improvement in the evidence of student background distribution after the policy was implemented. Our results do indicate heterogeneous effects by levels of pre-existing residential segregation and local school supply. So we also find suggestive evidence on this potential mechanism. So high SES families responding to the new policy by out-migrating from public and voucher schools to private schools. And therefore, we conclude that any policy that aims to improve diversity within school must take into account the school district features. So that's everything.
Great, thank you, Macarena. That was really, really awesome. Let's move along. We're steaming along right on time here. So if we could.
So Andrew, sorry, it's Greg.
Yes.
Hi, how are you?
Hey.
Greg a lot. Hey. Should we save our questions till the end? Was that the idea?
Yes, please.
Okay. Okay.
I think we blocked out some time, and since we're on time, I think we'll actually have time at the end too, not just.
Okay.
Catalina, do you have PowerPoint ready to go?
Yes. Yes.
Cool. Great.
Okay.
Take it
Can
away.
you see it?
Good.
Okay. Thanks. Okay. My name is Catalina Canals, and I am going to present competition in local educational markets, the case of Chile. So we are going to continue talking about Chile. And this is a research that I have been developing with Manuel Matas, Alejandra Misala, and Patricio Rodriguez. The motivation of this study is that in last decades, school choice policies have expanded over the world. That is true for the US and also for low and middle income countries. And that kind of policy seeks to stimulate competitions among schools, trying to increase the quality of the educational system. And also they look for improving the choice opportunity for parents. In that context, it is crucial to understand if the market structure that results from this kind of policy is the one required to promote these aims, is the one required to promote quality improvement, is the one that required to increase educative opportunities. So with that focus, we realize that most of the research on the effectiveness of school market policies has focused on analyzing if there is a relation between the competition in the system and educational outcomes. Instead of looking at the market structure itself, they have tried to delve into the relation between competition and educational outcomes. And the research has been quite inconclusive. We have a lot of research that found that there is a positive association between competition and educational outcomes, and many other studies found no relation between the two variables. And we think that this inconclusiveness of the research, it may be affected by an unsolved methodological issue, and is how we define the relevant market for schools. As school markets are geographic, it is not very straightforward how to measure that, how to limit the market. So we wanted to analyze that. So our approach was to use georeference data from schools and students from Santiago, the capital city of Chile, to characterize the market structure resulting from a national school choice system. So on the first step, we present alternative definition of school markets. This, based on previous literature, we define 3 definitions. We propose an operationalization for each of them, and then based on the principle that 2 schools compete if the price or standardized test score of one of the schools affect the price of the other, we identify the best definition of a school market for the case of Santiago. Having that definition, we then characterize the Santiago school market structure, and we discuss our findings. So to give you a bit of context, I think that Macarena in her presentation already told us a little bit about about the situation in Chile. We had a very wide school choice system. In the 80s, a reform was passed that introduced this voucher to schools. So we have both public and private voucher schools funded by this per student subsidy. And in addition, we have these private fee-paying schools that are like private schools funded by the fees paid by the parents. So this is a very wide school choice system, and we analyze the situation before the inclusion law that Macarena described. So we're in a situation when we don't have decentralized application system, but we do have this very wide school choice system.
In this context, we use data for both public schools and private voucher schools that are most of the schools of the city, and that is more than 1,000 of schools and more than 400,000 students. So the first step of our approach was to define the different market, the alternative market definitions. So we tried 3 definitions. The first one, we call it school switching approach. And the idea is that we are going to include in a school markets the schools that previously had students who later switched to the other schools, or vice versa. For example, if this is the initial situation, and this is, for example, 1 year later, we will say that school A compete or include in its market school C, because this student used to go to school C and it switched and now it attends school A. Also, we will include in school A's market school B, because in an original situation, this student used to attend school A and then it switched to B. That is the first definition. The second definition, we call it the shipment approach. And in this definition, we define first a neighborhood of the school. And we assume that the neighborhood of the school is the closest area that include the 75% of student homes. And we assume that a school competes with the schools located in that neighborhood. So for example, here in the figure, we have this school, school B, and we have this area that is the neighborhood, the area where most of its students live. And as this area includes school C and A, both of them are going to be included in its market. And the last definition, we call it the nearest neighbor approach. And under this definition, the market of a school J includes the schools closest to its students, and also the schools attended by the student whose closest school is a school J. So in the figure, we have, for example, that these students, they attend school A, but their closest school is C. So for that reason, we include C in the market of school A. Also, this student also attend school A, but their closest school is school D. So we include it also in the market. And in addition, we have these students that they attend C, but A is their closest school. So for that reason, we also include C in the market. So in that way, we have 3 different definitions of a school market. For all the definition, we exclude from a school market those schools that are attending a student from other educational levels, so they are not able to compete. And also if they attend only a student from different sexes for the same reason. In addition, it worth noticing that the second and the third approach are strictly geographical. The definition that I just gave you are strictly geographical. And the problem with this is that we may wrongly include in the same market a school that target different populations. So to avoid that problem, we made some additional restriction. We exclude schools that offer different religions. They had different religion affiliations. Also, if they offer different type of secondary education, we have 2 types of secondary education: scientific, humanistic, or technical vocational. Or we also exclude schools that have a large price difference. And for every definition, we assume that the demand of the market were the students enrolled in the schools of the market that are admissible in the school that we are analyzing. We also tried different specification of this definition, trying different neighborhood, for example, different threshold of prices, different specification, and our outcomes were robust to those variations. So once that we have these 3 different definitions, with each definition, we estimated the following model. The idea of the model was to measure if, given a definition, the price and the standardized test of the competitor of a school affect the price of the schools. because if they are really of the same market, the school should be affected by the price and standardized test scores of the other schools. So in this model, our dependent variable was this, that is the change in the school price. So it was the price of the schools in 2015, less the price in the previous year. And this price could be affected by the price difference, that will be the difference between the price of the schools in the previous year and the average price of its competitors, given a market definition. Here we have this variable that is similar to the other, but it's just for the test score. So it's the difference between the school test scores in 2014, less the average test scores of the schools included in the market. And we were controlling also for the possibility of having a demand shock in the neighborhood of the school. So with this specification, if a market definition is appropriate, we should expect that beta be negative, because that will imply that the school decrease their price, with its price is higher than their competitors. And for this, in the same logic, we will expect this coefficient to be positive, because that will mean that the school decrease the price when its standardized test scores are lower than the competitors. So we estimated the regression, the model for the three definitions, and here are the outcomes. And we found that in all the cases, we have the coefficients in the expected direction, but for the case of the nearest neighbor, we found larger effects. So for that reason, we selected this definition because it was able to recognize in a better way to which schools a school react. So having picked that definition, we conducted an analysis to characterize the market structure of Santiago. So we looked to several indicators, but I would like to highlight here this index of competition. When we have the 10,000, that implies no competition is a monopoly, 0 is highly competitive, and is commonly used that above 1800 is a high concentration of the market. So here we found that on average we have concentrated markets that also are a small market, because they have on average 7 schools, and geographically they are also small, because the distance from the schools to the farthest competitor is around 4 kilometers. We saw that it was possible to have some heterogeneity, so we conducted a K-means estimation to identify different groups of schools that have different characteristics and different markets. And most of the students attend this kind of schools that are public school with a small markets, or private voucher school with a small markets. So here you have the market characteristics of those groups, and you can realize that these kind of both groups are groups that are small, in the sense that the distance between the schools and the further competitor is less than 3 kilometers. In that sense, they are small markets. And these kind of schools are also schools that have low standardized test scores and tend to have low prices. Another group are the school with large market, the one from here. A school with large market have a lot of suppliers, around on average 12 suppliers, much more than the other groups, but they have also low standardized test scores. And the last group, we call it exclusive school with concentrated markets. This group, they are the most concentrated group, and their main characteristics are that they are the most expensive school, as you can see here, and also the schools with higher standardized test scores. We also looked into the geographic distribution of different schools in the city. So here you have the 4 groups, and you can see that the first two groups private voucher school with a small market and public school with a small market are very dispersed on the city. They are in most every common district of the city, you can find one of them. A school with large market are not at the center. An exclusive school with extensive market, they tend to be close to important avenues of the city. Here we have an important avenue, here we have another, so their location is related to the structure of the city, and it's not close to the household, to the location of every household. So as a discussion with this analysis, we found that the educational markets of Santiago are concentrated and generally small. We also found that most students attend public or private voucher school with small markets that have low scores and standardized national tests. We also found that the group exclusive school with extensive market, that are the ones with the highest test scores, they are not accessible for most of the population because they are expensive, the most expensive group, and also they are not so dispersed, geographically dispersed as other groups. So given this market structure, we state that this market structure does not generate competitive pressure because it's not competitive, so it's not going to be able to do that. So as we don't have that competitive structure, we cannot trust that the market structure will improve the quality, will produce this increase of quality of the system that was expected for this kind of policy. We're noticing that this policy was applied in the 80s, so we have had a long application of the policy. And so in more general terms, the school choice policies do not necessarily generate the market structure in which its benefits rely. And finally, we found that the most appropriate definition for the capital of Santiago, sorry, the most appropriate definition of market for the case of Santiago was the nearest neighbor, in which we assume that a school competes with the schools closest to its student. So this highlights the relevance of the city configuration in the market, because we could have assumed that a school competes with its closest school. That was the shipment approach, but this approach was better because it captured the real location of its students that is affected, for example, for big roads or for metro station, for all the connectivity. So the city configuration is really important to think into educational markets. And in more general terms, with this approach, we offer a methodology to identify the most adequate definition of relevant market that it can be used on further research for other cities, for other countries, and even for other geographic markets. Thank you for your attention.
Awesome. Thank you, Catalina. That's cool. All right. So I will keep myself either on time or ahead of time to make sure we have plenty of time for discussion of these three great papers plus mine. I'm happy to be presenting this joint work with Diana No from Occidental College on preferences, access, and the STEM gender gap in a now familiar setting, thanks to Marco's excellent presentation setting up the Mexico City high school choice system, and which is where we're going to be today in this talk. So probably don't need to state this. I think this is known in this audience, but there's a large gender gap in STEM education, not only in Latin America, but throughout the world. More men study STEM than women as proportion, and we see the reverberations of this in the labor market, where we see men are disproportionately likely to work in STEM compared to women. Okay, sort of unfairly dichotomizing the existing literature, which is very vast, on the determinants of this gap. I want to point out that on one hand, there's argument that there are gendered preferences, gendered beliefs, gendered constraints. This isn't to say that women don't like STEM. It could be that there are other sort of constraints on their ability to express their preference for STEM and go out and study it, for example. And on the other hand, you have the potential that I think Marco has nicely pointed out, there are institutional barriers to access, in particular when assignment systems use things like placement exams to determine placement. Okay, and so why do we care which one of these sort of broad groups of determinants is active or dominant? Well, that matters a lot for design of policy if the policymaker, the social planner's position is that we need to shrink this gap, whether because it's a good in itself to shrink the gap or because it's viewed that increasing women's participation in STEM could have, for example, efficiency gains for the economy at large. Okay, so what we want to do in this paper is to look at the public high school choice system in Mexico City, where you have this assignment process that allows you to observe revealed preferences and the placement exam that takes those preferences and maps them into assignment outcomes. This is a setting in which there are clear STEM and non-STEM options. And those STEM and non-STEM, that kind of like dichotomy exists both at the level of elite schools and at the level of non-elite schools. So we can sort of get at a little bit more richness of preferences for STEM by gender. And in studying this context, we think we can answer pretty satisfactorily these following three questions. First, what is it that's primarily driving the STEM gap in the centralized assignment system? Is it preferences, really choices, right? Or is it access as determined by this placement process? With those results in hand, we can try to understand how counterfactual policies that affect the priority structure primarily would narrow or widen the STEM gap. And finally, what would the welfare consequences of these policies be? So that's interesting. We'll never know what was on that slide. Oh no, I have an idea. Okay, so what do we actually do? We estimate a structural model of school choice to estimate preferences as expressed by willingness to travel for program characteristics. We'll focus on STEM programs, whether they be elite STEM programs or non-elite STEM programs. And then we're going to crucially estimate these preferences separately by gender so we can see what these differences look like between males and females in terms of STEM preference. We're going to use that structural model, like the outputs of that model, useful in itself for descriptive purposes, but then we can feed that into a counterfactual simulation, which we tried to understand the counterfactual effects on the STEM gap and welfare of change the priority structure, in particular, different kinds of affirmative action. Or you can imagine, you don't have to imagine, you can look to the literature and see that there's a preponderance of interventions, nudges, and so forth to try to increase females' preference for studying STEM. We can see how those would kind of propagate through this mechanism and result in changes in the STEM gap. All right, so that's where I'm going. Not to repeat Marco too much, but school choice in Mexico City looks the following way. If you want to go to basically any public high school in Mexico City, you need to participate in the COMIPEM's centralized system. You do this in the final year of middle school, which is 9th grade in Mexico. You rank up to 20 you rank order them up to 20 high school programs out of over 600 options during our sample period. And those could be a specific career track program within a particular school, right? So you have a lot more options than you have schools. And you take this multi-subject placement exam and you compete against about 250,000 or more other applicants each year for a spot in the school of your choice. So this assignment mechanism is a special kind of student proposing deferred acceptance mechanism. They call it serial dictatorship. Students get ranked by score. Computer goes down the list student by student and gives each student their most preferred program as according to their list at the time that still has a seat open for them when their turn comes up. Something important about this is that when you allow students to list a sufficiently long rank order list, as is the case here with 20 choices, this incentivizes truthful revelation of preferences. There's no sense in which you can game the system by misreporting your preferences. Okay, just quickly, there are sort of two dimensions in which we're conceptualizing programs differing in in this paper, in which we're really thinking about STEM, there are elite and non-elite schools. Among the elite schools, there are like the Polytechnic affiliated schools that are high quality elite STEM. The UNAM is generally non-STEM, at least compared to the Polytechnic schools, but it's still elite. In the non-elite category, in the non-STEM category, you have just like general education programs that are not vocational, but you also have vocational programs that are not STEM oriented. Okay, and then there are STEM-oriented vocational programs as well that are not elite. How do we determine whether a particular career track or track of study is elite or not, or sorry, is STEM focused or not? We use this excellent Brookings Institution report from 2013 that classified occupations as STEM or non-STEM. We map those occupations back to the career track that is obviously geared toward preparing students for. So like optometry, for example, prepares optometrists. And we determine whether a program is STEM or not based on basically what it's training people to do. That's usually pretty clear from the name of the program and so forth. Okay, so what do we have in terms of data? I'm using the 2004 through 2009 COMEPEM's administrative data. This is the full ranked list of programs that students submitted, placement exam score with subscores, the program they end up assigned to. Those give us the admissions cutoff scores that resulted from the assignment mechanism. We have some demographics, and then we have GIS data that allow us to approximately place students on the map, and we can precisely place schools on the map in order to get a proxy for commuting distance. All right, so descriptively, just to tell you that yes, there is a STEM gap. Looking at this dashed line across, this is at about 11 percentage points. Basically, 40% of males end up studying something that looks that we classify as STEM, whereas less than 30% females do. Interestingly, at least to me, across the ability or placement score distribution across these 5 quintiles, this gap is pretty consistent, not deviating very much from this average 11 percentage points. What you see though is that it's not until you get to the very high achievers that this gap is being driven by the elite STEM programs being more filled by males than females at the bottom. So the STEM gap isn't a story of high versus low ability or anything like that. It's pretty consistent across the placement score distribution. Okay, you've already seen this picture, but not in blue and pink, so I'll show it again. I'm appealing to your gender biases here with the color coding to show you that males, the distribution of test scores for males basically dominates the test score distribution for females. The mean is significantly higher, and you can see even at high levels of ability, there's a lot more men there in the right tail than females. Okay, so in contrast, middle school GPA, girls do better, as you've already seen in Marco's excellent talk, and I was happy to see the shapes of these things look very similar, felt very affirmed. So I'm not going to write down the whole choice model that we're going to use to estimate the preferences, but I'll give you a flavor of what we're doing. This is borrowing heavily from Abdul Kadaroglu et al.'s recent paper in the AER, in which they estimate heterogeneous preferences in a parameterized way, in a sense, but like in the richest way possible. So that they're not estimating like a mixed logit, they're estimating for every possible covariate cell basically they can form, they're estimating a separate rank ordered logit. So for example, for a particular year, student living in a particular region of the city, in a particular exam score quintile with a particular gender, okay, we're going to gather all those students up into covariate cell, and we're going to estimate the following utility model. Your utility to student I for school J is going to be the function of a program fixed effect, which gives us a bunch of flexibility in terms of preferences for specific schools rather than just school characteristics. It's also a function of distance, and then obviously this IID, an observable term. We add some additional features just to deal with the institutional context and some data issues. We're going to parameterize some additional dimensions of heterogeneity that we don't use to determine covariate cell, things like parental education and so forth. And then we're going to model choice behavior with respect to some schools that are ex ante infeasible. If I choose a very low cutoff school, I know that I can't choose a high cutoff school below it and ever be assigned to it, right? Because of the way serial dictatorship mechanism works, we try to build that in a very reduced form way into the model. And the proof is kind of in the pudding there. We end up with a pretty good fit, which I won't show you, but we estimate the exploded logit model by MLE, and we get a bunch of fixed, like school by cell fixed effects, right? We want to get willingness to travel, so we divide by the distance coefficient, and we project that willingness to travel for a particular kind of student for a particular school on the school's characteristics, right? So it's like a two-step process where we're projecting we estimate the fixed effects, then we project fixed effects on the characteristics of that school, and we allow that projection to be different with respect to whether the student is a male or a female. Okay, so it's these gammas that we really care about. I'm going to just show some pictures now. Again, the blue is the male willingness to travel for a particular school characteristic, and the pink is female. You see that males have a higher willingness to travel, 16.3 kilometers, than females for elite STEM schools. This isn't a huge difference, right? Men and women aren't so different, but there is a higher revealed preference for elite STEM schools. This is also true for non-elite STEM schools, although the difference is larger. And we see these are not identical, but to a rounding error, identical point estimates for preferences. There are supposed to be 95% confidence intervals here, but we have so much data that they're just too small to see in some cases. Okay, so what do these differences look like? These were levels. Now I'm going to show you the differences with respect to exam score quintile to see if this is a story of high achieving versus low achieving students being different from each other. And what we see is as you move through the different quintiles, there aren't dramatic differences by quintile in these like gendered preferences, okay, either for elite or non-elite STEM. I'll leave it at that and say with these preference parameters now in hand, what we can do is use these logit parameters and the logit probabilities that come from them to simulate student portfolios, right, counterfactual student portfolios. Then I'm going to feed those portfolios into the placement mechanism, either the status quo or the counterfactual that we have in mind. And we're going to compare the STEM gaps that we get in the simulated status quo to what we get in the simulated like policy counterfactual, okay, and see whether we make the gap wider or narrower with different policy reforms. Okay, let me guide you through this table. We don't need to look at every number, but the baseline gap that we simulate is about 10.5 percentage points, which is pretty close to the empirical gap of about 11 percentage points. What happens when we get rid of merit-based admissions altogether and use a lottery? The STEM gap actually increases by 11%. If we do what I think Marco and Maria are doing, which is to have a composite score plus GPA kind of approach, you widen the STEM gap substantially. Why is this? Well, on average, you are giving females higher priority, but females' preferences on average are more toward non-STEM than to STEM options. So when you give them more of what they say they want on the rank ordered list, they sort away from STEM and toward non-STEM options, okay? So you can't close the STEM gap with either that approach or just a general affirmative action approach where you either close the gap in scores 4 points or you do something more radical, have standard deviation points. You end up widening the STEM gap substantially. The only way to close the STEM gap that we think is sort of like feasible within this deferred acceptance mechanism is to give females affirmative action, but only at STEM schools. When you do that, it's possible to fully close the STEM gap, although you can't fully close the non-elite STEM gap. Okay, so what's my point? You have to understand what role preferences are playing in the STEM gap before you try to solve the gap by a policy. Right? If on the other hand, you didn't want to or you couldn't intervene in the priority structure, one thing that you could do is imagine intervening by nudging females to change their preferences to value STEM more, revealed prefer STEM more, right? So suppose that you had an intervention, this would be a quite successful intervention that increased female willingness to travel for STEM schools by 1 kilometer, 11% of the mean distance that of the schools that people report. You can close the STEM gap by about a third, okay? more targeted interventions close it by less. But that kind of gives you an idea, a bound on what a reasonable intervention might be able to do in terms of closing the gap just on the demand side, from the demand side. Okay, finally, we can say something about welfare here because we estimated a utility model. We can compare these like commute distance denominated consumer surplus changes as a result of changing the priority structure. Basically, just to sum up, all these priority structure changes increase female welfare while reducing male welfare, which shouldn't be surprising given the changes that we proposed. And the lottery and the Score Plus GPA admissions, we found reduced aggregate welfare. The Score Plus GPA one, not by much. The lottery is catastrophic for welfare because preferences for highly demanded schools are stronger among high scorers. When you break that link between your score and the kind of school that you can get into, there's an aggregate welfare loss because people are not getting schools that they value very highly as often. That makes sense. Okay, so focusing on the STEM affirmative action, we think that in some sense it's a promising policy in that it closes the STEM gap with fairly small, okay, this is subjective, the word small, consequences for welfare. Female welfare goes up by about 0.4 kilometers, male welfare down by about half a kilometer, and aggregate welfare is basically left unchanged. Okay, so there's not a ton of redistribution when you consider the average commute one way for both men and women is around 8 kilometers. This isn't a huge difference in commute equivalent welfare compared to that base, if that helps to interpret it. Okay, so just recapping, there's a big STEM gender gap, probably not surprising, exists in both elite and non-elite STEM schools. It's driven mostly by different reported preferences, okay, which we should definitely acknowledge are produced by both underlying preferences, perceived constraints, perceived, existence of discrimination that they'll face at a technical school, at a STEM school program if they go there, anticipated discrimination in the labor market and so forth. Those show up as reported preferences, right? And to the extent that policymakers would like to close the STEM gap, our main point is that you need to really understand where the gap is coming from and carefully tailor the reform to your policy objective, right? So global affirmative action that indiscriminately advantages women, right, without respect to the kind of the program, that's going to widen the STEM gap, whereas a more targeted approach could narrow it with small welfare costs. I will leave it there and let's open it up to discussion. Thanks. So Greg, if you're still here, you are welcome to jump in. I think we lost you. Oh man, that was a missed opportunity. Okay, otherwise, congrats to all three of you, and I will look for raised hands to open up for questions. Yes, Mark.
Hi, Andrew. So I just have 3 questions about your paper. So the first one is that I see that you're classifying UNAM as not STEM. Like one of the lead subsystems, UNAM is not STEM. But as far as I'm aware, I think a lot of people go to UNAM to do STEM, to do math and science. I think the main difference is that because it's a general track, you don't choose it from the beginning. It's like after the first year, you choose which track you want to do. So, but most of the students that go to this UNAM school, they go to do STEM. So I guess maybe if there was a way you could access, like after the tracking has occurred, maybe you would have a, or otherwise, I think you're missing something there because this UNAM and many general track schools do often STEM education. It's just that they do not ask you to demand it from the beginning. Depending on your first year, you can choose it later. I think that's what I understand from the system. The second thing has to do with when you estimate preferences, you're including the Comipem's exam score as one individual level characteristics. But when you try to microfound these choice models, you need to use, sometimes you use the information that they had at the time when they make the choices. And they did not know their admission exam score when they chose the schools. So in that sense, maybe you have access to some other standardized tests that you could use that they did know at the time they made their choices that could help with the preference estimation. Otherwise, I think it's like putting the priority index that they did not know as part of the way they calculate the utilities. And the third one, I think, is about usually when people care about these STEM gaps, they care about like outcomes, right? Because you can provide a lot of access to, let's say, more females or more poor students to these STEM schools, but they all fail and they all do not graduate, right? Or they all get worse grades and worse outcomes. So in that sense, maybe if you had some kind of outcome that you could relate to this, because otherwise, it's a bit interesting, that give more access, but if the access does not translate into outcomes, it's a bit, it's hard to tell if it's good or bad, let's say. But yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks. Because that was 3 questions, I'll choose one to answer the second, which is, why include test score in sort of the delineation of these like covariate cells that we use? I think from I understand the perspective that this is unknown to the student at the time of choosing. But that said, I mean, well, we know from Mateo and Veronica's paper that they don't know it perfectly. They have an idea, first of all. Second of all, I think even if you don't, this is just a way for us to flexibly sort of use a proxy of ability, let's say, like warts and all, a proxy for ability to allow students to of varying levels of kind of test reflected ability to have different preferences in sort of the most flexible way that we can. I take the point, although I will say that as you know, when you're confronting an SPD, a mechanism, knowing your priority score should not affect the rank order list that you submit, right? No, it's actually not informative to me in terms of strategically, it's not informative to me about what I should list. Good points. Okay, and then I'll let, did I see another hand up? Did it go down? No, maybe someone was just waving. Other questions? Yes, Maria Elena, good to see you.
Another question for Andrew, because I know better the context. So, Andrew, have you considered using for this STEM the composition of the standardized test that they are taking? Because something we have discussed in the past is that this test has like the physics, the chemistry, but it also is on math, but it's also evaluating history, for example, that it might not be so relevant for the STEM tracks. So have you tried to do something playing with how well they are performing in the different sections of the test? And maybe that is also going to give you some information about their predictions. So some very good at physics might perform better in physics, and that's why he is in advance trying to choose a STEM compared to someone that maybe is very good in history or writing. So I don't know. I think there is something to play around with this composition of the total score.
I agree totally. And in fact, one of the measures that we include in the choice model, as part of this like parameterized heterogeneity that we put in the choice model, is what we call STEM comparative advantage, which is basically the proportion of your total score that's coming from those STEM subscores. And then in the paper, we look at sort of how that relates to demand. And yes, STEM comparative advantage is predictive of your preferences for STEM schools, but it's not, for example, it can't explain the male-female difference in preferences. Something we haven't thought about a lot is using that, using subscores differently to in terms of how they're treated in the priority structure, which is maybe another way to go. It's a good one. I have a question. Nobody else does. I can fire a question back at Marco. I'm sorry to exclude the Chilean papers, so I'll make this quick. I really like, I think that dropout is the first order outcome that we should worry about in Mexico City. It's an environment with like extremely high dropout rate, and that's very, very problematic and to the extent that mismatch is at play. I think the paper's right on. What I'd like to know is there any other margin that you have any ability to address in the data with respect to achievement or some other outcome in terms of when you shift dropout around? Is that complementary to like, it's complementary to learning? Is it moving in the opposite direction? I don't know. I'm trying to figure out if we're facing a trade-off, or this would be a win-win for both graduation and for learning.
Yeah, so ideally would have data on test scores or how they perform like at high school, but we don't have the data. I mean, we can try to get it at some point. The other option would be to use a proxy like, you know, Enlace or one of those things, but that also comes with its own problems, right? So I think, so in that sense, you know, we decided to focus on this graduation because that's the administrative data that we have. And yeah, of course, I think it's interesting would be, ideally, you know, I was trying to get the GPAs they got during high school, but yeah, I couldn't get the data. But I think graduation is so important, at least in that context, that I'm quite happy with having access to that measurement. So.
Oh, absolutely. And you know, in the next paper, a few years down the road, match it to the labor market data. These guys are getting pretty old that we've observed in Comipems, and eventually the Social Security Administration will match that data for you. I know it. Yeah,
no, that would be my dream. that would make me really happy.
We've all been dreaming about that merge. Okay, other questions? I have a question then. For either of you, thinking about segregation, this isn't totally related to the exact work that you did, but do either of you have something to say about the role that like transit access plays in generating in a systematic way in generating segregation in these markets, where I feel like we can measure distance pretty well and maybe measure commuting distance, but to what extent is the work that you're doing sort of conscious of like the urban geography of transit availability?
I think, Andrew, it's a very important question. So, for example, in the Chilean case, in this centralized admission system, a very important component that's different from the centralized systems applied in the US is that there is not this, we don't have this neighborhood priority, right? So since we find that there's a high residential segregation in a lot of the municipalities, what this means is even though schools may not be able to select students like directly by doing some kind of entry exam or parental interviews, it's not completely true that the set of schools that they can apply it's much higher than before, right? So since and especially because low-income students, one of the main reasons why they choose a school is because of the distance to school. So since they live closer to worse schools in terms of test scores. I think an important component of a reform like this could have been giving, for example, a voucher for transportation to better schools that are located in different municipalities or municipalities farther away from their houses.
Okay, I just looked at the clock. I think we're officially out of time. Is that right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but the room is free, so you can stay here and talk a little bit more. It's not a problem.
cool. All right. Well, formally, let's close the session. Thanks everybody for visiting. This was a really enjoyable session, and appreciate your attendance. So I'll stick on for a couple minutes just to